Hi everyone, I'm back with my washed swatch for our spring knit along. I'm using Barocco Indigo and I started with one needle size. I purled across a row to mark where I switched to the next needle size, and I did a second needle. My gauge after washing for my second needle size worked better than my first, so I'm glad I switched and did that all in one piece so I didn't have to go back and knit another swatch. So it was really important that I wash this swatch. Before washing, the stitch gauge for this needle size was a little bit small. I got 21 stitches to 4 inches. And then post-washing, it relaxed just a smidge, just ever so slightly. So that's 1/4 of a stitch over each inch. 20 stitches equals 4 inches. Over the course of a sweater, that makes a pretty good difference. I want to make sure that my sweater comes out the right size. So I'm going to knit with this second needle size because after washing, it got the correct gauge. I did achieve stitch gauge with this second needle size, but I did not achieve row gauge. I did get a row gauge of 30 rows over 4 inches instead of the 27 required in the pattern. So I'm just going to do a quick little knitting math check to make sure that the lengths in this pattern work out for me at this gauge, because I'm going to stick with this needle size. I like the 20 stitches, and even though the row gauge isn't quite right, I'm going to adjust my pattern rather than change my needle size from here. So my row gauge of 30 rows over 4 inches, that's 7.5 rows per inch. A good place to check would be the raglan increases on this pattern. The designer has written those increases for my size to happen over 54 rows, if I've counted correctly. In those 54 rows, in the designer's row gauge, it would be 8 inches deep. If I knit it in my row gauge as written, I can do a little bit of math to determine that mine would be 7.2 inches deep. Now, within the ease of this sweater, that would still fit me. That would still be pretty comfortable. It has a little bit of a loose fit still. It won't be all up in my armpit. So I know that I can knit this as written and not change how the increases work out. If your row gauge is significantly different from the designer's required row gauge, you might consider altering how those increases happen. So if I did want to achieve the 8 inches deep that the pattern requires for my size, I would need to knit 60 rows instead of 54. So I would want to add 6 extra rows into my raglan increases. And I would probably want to do that evenly spaced throughout those increases, so we can do a little bit of division to figure out how often I would add that extra round in. So I can use this same math to double check any of the lengths in this pattern, the placement of the pocket on the front, the overall body length, or the sleeve length. Most of those lengths I was going to change a little bit anyway, since the circumference for this size, the size small, worked for me, but the lengths all seemed just a little bit off from where I wanted them to measure. So in the end, the lesson here is that post-washing, you want to choose the needle size that gets you stitch gauge after your swatch has been washed. So I'm going to choose this second needle size, a size 6, which got me 20 stitches to 4 inches. Even though the row gauge is a little different. And then I did my math to double check that that difference in row gauge wouldn't significantly change the sweater for me. So let me know if you have any questions on how your gauge swatch came out, what needle size you're going to use, and if your row gauge is significantly off, if you need any help with any of the knitting math. And let's get started with this sweater.